The Alpha's Forsaken Bride. Brielle Vex had never believed in the stories of the Lost Court, of the wolves who ruled before time had a name. But when she stumbled upon the ruins deep in the frozen mountains, she felt it a presence, waiting. The wind howled, carrying voices not meant for human ears. The earth trembled beneath her feet. And then the ice cracked, and something woke. A man stood before her, half in shadow, his silver eyes locked onto hers with something close to recognition. "You should not have come here," he murmured. "Now you must take your rightful place." Chapter 1. The Whisper of Ancient Stones. The biting wind whipped at Brielle's exposed cheeks, stinging them a furious red. She pulled her thick, woolen scarf higher, tucking it around her nose, but the Alaskan cold was relentless. It seeped into her bones, a constant reminder of the unforgiving landscape she called home. 62 years she'd lived in this wilderness, and still, it felt like a test, a constant proving ground. Today, the test felt different. A prickling unease had settled in her stomach since dawn, a feeling she couldn't shake, even after her usual grounding ritual of morning coffee and bird watching. Brielle adjusted the heavy pack on her back, the familiar weight of her geological survey equipment a small comfort. She was mapping a remote section of the Chugach Mountains, a region largely untouched by human hands. Her job, charting the geological formations, was solitary, often lonely, but it was a life she'd chosen, a life that offered a strange sort of peace. Or, at least, it had. The silence of the mountains was usually a balm to her soul, a vast, white canvas upon which she could paint her thoughts, her regrets, her quiet hopes. Today, however, the silence felt charged, like a held breath before a scream. The wind, usually a steady drone, now seemed to whisper, carrying snatches of sound that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. "Just the wind, Brielle," she muttered to herself, her voice swallowed by the vastness. Just the wind. She consulted her GPS, the modern technology a stark contrast to the ancient landscape surrounding her. Her destination, a peculiar rock formation noted on an old, hand-drawn map she'd found in the archives of the local historical society, was still a few kilometers away. The map, almost a century old, had intrigued her. It spoke of the Whispering Stones, a place marked with a curious symbol, a circle bisected by a crescent moon. The accompanying notes, written in faded ink, hinted at local legends, dismissed as mere folklore by the author, of a place where the earth spoke. Brielle, a woman of science, wasn't one for folklore, but she was a woman of curiosity, and the strange energy she felt in the air today only fueled that curiosity. She trekked on, the crunch of her snowshoes on the packed snow the only sound accompanying her labored breathing. The landscape began to change, the gentle slopes giving way to steeper inclines, the snow-covered pines thinning to reveal jagged, black rock. The air grew colder, sharper, and the whispering intensified. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was something else. Something deeper. She rounded a towering outcrop of rock, and there it was. The Whispering Stones. It wasn't what she expected. Not a dramatic peak or a towering cliff face. Instead, it was a natural amphitheater, a bowl carved into the mountainside, surrounded by a ring of jagged, black rocks that seemed to absorb the light. The snow here was undisturbed, a pristine blanket of white, save for a single, narrow path leading into the center of the bowl. The path looked almost deliberate, as if something had walked there recently. Brielle hesitated, her scientific mind warring with a primal instinct that urged her to turn back. The unease she'd felt all day intensified, blossoming into a full-blown sense of dread. But something else, something stronger, pulled her forward. Curiosity. A yearning for something she couldn't name. She took a tentative step onto the path, her snowshoes sinking slightly into the fresh powder. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. She could almost make out words, fragments of a language she didn't understand, yet somehow felt deep in her bones. As she reached the center of the amphitheater, the ground beneath her feet began to vibrate. A low hum resonated through the air, growing in intensity. The black rocks surrounding the bowl seemed to shimmer, their surfaces rippling like water. Brielle stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. Fear, raw and primal, threatened to overwhelm her. She wanted to run, to escape this place, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The humming intensified, becoming a deep, resonant drone that seemed to vibrate the very air around her. The snow on the ground began to swirl, rising in a miniature vortex around her feet. And then she heard it. A voice. Not a whisper, but a clear, resonant voice, speaking in that same unknown language. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A voice that spoke of power, of loss, of a forgotten kingdom. Brielle closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the sensory overload. She felt a strange pull, a connection to this place, to the voice, to the ancient power that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. A feeling of coming home. When she opened her eyes, the swirling snow had settled. The humming had subsided. The silence, once again, descended upon the mountains. But it was a different silence now. A silence filled with anticipation. A silence that held its breath. She looked down at her hands, her gloved fingers trembling.
She felt changed.
As if something had shifted within her, awakened something that had long been dormant. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the amphitheater, scattering the snow and carrying with it a faint, musky scent that reminded her of pine needles, cold earth, and something else, something wild and untamed. She turned her head, searching for the source of the scent, her eyes scanning the surrounding rocks. That's when she saw it. A shadow, moving among the rocks. Too large to be a wolf. Too human. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadow moved again, resolving itself into a figure.
A man.
Standing at the edge of the amphitheater, watching her. He was tall, cloaked in shadows, his features obscured by the dim light. But she could see his eyes. Silver. Glowing with an unnatural light. And they were locked on hers. Brielle stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Recognition? No, that was impossible. She had never seen this man before in her life. Yet he took a step towards her, and the air crackled with energy. The whispering returned, louder now, more insistent. The ground beneath her feet trembled again. You shouldn't have come here, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate deep within her chest. It was an American accent, and under the rumble was a quality that suggested education, refinement, perhaps even aristocracy. His words, though seemingly simple, carried a weight, a warning that sent a shiver down her spine. She wanted to speak, to ask him who he was, what this place was, but her voice caught in her throat. He took another step, closing the distance between them. She could see him more clearly now. He was tall, powerfully built, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular frame. His hair was dark, almost black, and it fell to his shoulders in thick waves. His face was striking. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a straight nose. And those eyes. Silver eyes that seemed to pierce through her, seeing everything, knowing everything. He stopped a few feet away from her, his gaze unwavering. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the air. She could smell that musky scent again, stronger now, more intoxicating. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He looked, despite his words, not angry, more sad. And if she wasn't imagining it, relieved. Now, he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper, you must take your rightful place. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, with a destiny she didn't understand. Brielle's mind reeled. What place? What was he talking about? She opened her mouth to speak, to question him, but before she could utter a word, the ground beneath her feet gave way. A crack, spider webbing across the snow-covered earth, appeared between them, and the earth started crumbling.
She was going to fall.
Chapter 2. Echoes in the frozen wasteland. The ground crumbled beneath Brielle's feet with a sickening crunch. She flailed, her arms windmilling, trying to find purchase on the shifting earth, but there was nothing to hold on to. The geological survey equipment on her back, usually a reassuring weight, now felt like an anchor, dragging her down. She cried out, a wordless scream swallowed by the wind and the roar of the collapsing ground. Then, strong arms were around her, pulling her back, away from the gaping chasm that had opened up between her and the silver-eyed man. He had moved with astonishing speed, a blur of motion that defied the eye. One moment he was standing across the widening fissure, the next he was holding her, his grip firm and unwavering. He pulled her against him, his body a solid wall of warmth against the biting cold. She could feel the hard planes of his chest beneath her cheek, the steady beat of his heart a counterpoint to the frantic hammering of her own. The musky scent that had intrigued her before now enveloped her, a comforting, grounding presence amidst the chaos. For a moment, they remained locked in that embrace, the only sound the ragged gasps of Brielle's breath and the low growl of the earth still settling around them. She was acutely aware of the strength in his arms, the way he held her, not possessively, but protectively. It was a strange sensation, this feeling of safety in the arms of a stranger, in the heart of a collapsing, ancient, magical place. Slowly, he released her, setting her gently on her feet, but keeping a hand on her arm, as if to steady her. She looked up at him, her breath still catching in her throat. His silver eyes, no longer glowing with that unnatural light, were filled with concern. And something else. Something that looked like relief. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough, laced with a hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. It was, as before, undeniably American, but with an underlying cadence that suggested something older, something otherworldly. Brielle nodded, her voice still lost somewhere in the depths of her fear. She managed a shaky, "Yes, I think so." He didn't release her arm. His gaze swept over her, assessing, searching for any sign of injury. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks under his intense scrutiny. It was a strange reaction, this flush of heat in the face of such danger, but there was something about his gaze, about his presence, that made her acutely aware of him, of herself. "That was close," she finally managed, her voice still trembling. He nodded, his gaze shifting to the chasm that had opened up between them. It was wider now, a gaping maw in the earth, revealing the dark, jagged rocks below. The whispering had stopped, replaced by the ominous creak and groan of the shifting earth. "This place, it's unstable," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. "More so than I thought." He turned back to her, his silver eyes locking onto hers. "You should leave.
Now."
Before he hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Before it's too late." Brielle's mind was still reeling. She was a woman of science, of logic, of reason. Yet, she had just witnessed something that defied all logic, all reason. A man who appeared out of nowhere, eyes that glowed with silver light, a collapsing earth, a whispering that seemed to speak to her soul. And yet, despite the fear, the confusion, the sheer impossibility of it all, she found herself strangely reluctant to leave. She had questions. So many questions. Who are you?" she asked, her voice finally finding its strength. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, as if searching for the right words. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the creak of the shifting earth. Finally, he said, "My name is Kaylin." It was a name that resonated with her, a name that felt both familiar and foreign. A name that seemed to echo the whispers she had heard in the stones. "Kaylin," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. It felt right. "And this place?" she continued, gesturing to the surrounding amphitheater, to the chasm that had opened up between them. "What is it?" Kaylin's gaze returned to the chasm, his expression hardening. "It's a prison," he said, his voice low, laced with a bitterness that sent a shiver down her spine.
"And a gateway."
"A prison? A gateway?" Brielle's mind struggled to make sense of his words. She was about to ask him to explain, but He cut her off. You need to go, he repeated, his voice urgent.
Now.
Before he stopped abruptly, his head snapping up, his eyes narrowing. He sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring, like a wild animal scenting danger. They're coming, he said, his voice a low growl. Who's coming? Brielle asked, her heart starting to pound again. He didn't answer. He grabbed her arm, his grip tightening. We need to move.
Now.
He started to pull her away from the chasm, towards the edge of the amphitheater, towards the towering, snow-covered pines that ringed the clearing. Brielle stumbled after him, her mind racing.
Who were they?
What was happening? She glanced back at the chasm, at the black rocks that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. She felt a strange pull, a reluctance to leave this place, despite the danger. It was as if a part of her belonged here, a part of her that had been awakened by the whispering stones, by Kalen's presence. But the urgency in his grip, the fear in his eyes, spurred her on. She followed him, her snowshoes crunching on the packed snow, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The wind whipped around them, carrying with it the scent of pine, of cold earth, and that same musky scent that clung to Kalen, a scent that both terrified and intrigued her. As they reached the edge of the trees, Kalen stopped, pulling her behind a towering pine, its branches heavy with snow. He pressed a finger to his lips, silencing her. She looked at him, her eyes wide with question. He nodded towards the clearing, his gaze fixed on something she couldn't see. She followed his gaze, peering through the branches of the pine. And then she saw them. Figures. Moving through the clearing. Silhouetted against the snow. They were too far away to make out any details, but there was something about their movements, something predatory, that sent a chill down her spine. They were coming from the direction of the chasm. From the prison.
From the gateway.
Kalen's grip tightened on her arm. She could feel the tension in his body, the coiled energy that seemed to radiate from him. He was ready to fight. But against whom?
And why?
The fear, which had subsided momentarily, clawed its way back up, almost paralyzing. The rational part of her screamed to flee, run as fast as she could back to civilization. But she also knew, looking at the set of Kalen's jaw, the glint in those incredible eyes, that running was not an option. Not anymore. He would face whatever was out there, and, inexplicably, she knew she'd face it with him. What was about to happen would change everything. Chapter 3. The Awakening of Shadows. The figures moved with an unsettling grace, gliding across the snow-covered clearing like phantoms. There were 5 of them, all clad in dark clothing that blended seamlessly with the shadows of the encroaching twilight. Brielle strained her eyes, trying to make out details, but the distance and the fading light made it difficult. They held something in their hands, long and glinting in the weak sunlight weapons. Kalen's grip on her arm was a vice, his body tense and coiled, ready to spring. He was watching the figures with a predatory intensity that both frightened and fascinated her. He was like a wild animal, cornered, but far from defeated.
Who are they?
Brielle whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustle of the wind in the pine needles. Kalen didn't answer immediately. He continued to watch the figures, his silver eyes narrowed, his nostrils flaring slightly, as if he were scenting the air. He was listening, too, she realized, attuned to sounds she couldn't hear, to nuances in the environment that were beyond her human perception. Hunters, he finally said, his voice a low growl, barely louder than her own whisper. The word was imbued with a venom, a hatred that sent a shiver down her spine. Hunters? Brielle repeated, her mind struggling to make sense of his words. Hunters of what? He glanced at her, his silver eyes flashing with a mixture of frustration and, was it pity? Of things they don't understand, he said, his voice tight. Of things they fear. He turned his gaze back to the figures, who were now closer, their movements more purposeful, more deliberate. They were fanning out, circling the clearing, as if searching for something. Or someone. Brielle's heart pounded in her chest. She had a sickening feeling that she knew what, or rather who, they were searching for. They're looking for you, she whispered, her voice trembling. Kalen nodded, his jaw clenched. And now, he added, his voice grim, they're looking for you, too. His words sent a wave of fear washing over her. She was caught up in something she didn't understand, something dangerous, something supernatural. The logical, rational part of her mind screamed in protest, but the primal, instinctive part of her knew that this was real. This was happening. She looked at Kalen, at his strong, determined face, at his silver eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. He was not human. Not entirely. She knew that now, with a certainty that defied all logic. And yet, she didn't feel afraid of him. She felt safe. Protected. It was a strange, paradoxical feeling, this sense of security in the presence of something so clearly otherworldly, so potentially dangerous. What do we do? She asked, her voice trembling, but firmer than before. She had to know, had to understand what was happening. Kalen didn't answer immediately. He was still watching the hunters, his body tense, his senses on high alert. He was calculating, assessing, planning his next move. We fight, he finally said, his voice low and resolute. Or we run. And right now, running is not an option. He looked at her, his silver eyes piercing through her, searching her soul. Can you fight? He asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Brielle hesitated. She was a geologist, not a fighter. She had never held a weapon in her life, never faced anything more dangerous than a grumpy bear on a remote hiking trail. But she looked at Kalen, at his unwavering gaze, at the trust he seemed to be placing in her, and she found a strength she didn't know she possessed. I don't know, she said, her voice trembling but honest. But I'll try. A flicker of something approval? Respect? Passed across his face. He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. Good, he said, his voice firm. Because we don't have a choice. He released her arm, finally, and stepped out from behind the tree, into the open. The hunters saw him immediately. They stopped their circling, their heads snapping up, their weapons raised. Brielle hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Fear threatened to overwhelm her, to paralyze her. But she remembered Kalen's words, his trust in her, and she pushed the fear aside. She took a deep breath, stepped out from behind the tree, and stood beside him. The hunters advanced, their movements slow and deliberate, their eyes fixed on Kalen. They were closer now, and Brielle could see their faces. They were hard, grim, their features etched with a fanaticism that sent a chill down her spine. They were not ordinary hunters. The one in the lead, a tall, gaunt man with a cruel smile, spoke. His voice was harsh, grating, like the sound of stones grinding together. Kalen, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. We've been looking for you. Kalen didn't reply. He stood his ground, his body tense, his eyes locked on the hunters. He was like a statue, carved from stone, radiating an aura of power and defiance. The hunter's smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth. You cannot escape us, he said. Your kind has no place in this world. Brielle felt a surge of anger rise within her. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew that these men were wrong. They were driven by fear and hatred, by a blind prejudice that blinded them to the truth. What do you want? She asked, her voice surprisingly steady. The hunter turned his gaze to her, his eyes narrowing. He looked her up and down, his expression dismissive. And who is this? He asked, his voice dripping with scorn. Another one of your pets? Brielle bristled at his words, at his insulting tone. She opened her mouth to retort, but Kalen spoke first. Leave her out of this, he said, his voice a low growl, laced with a warning that made the hair on the back of Brielle's neck stand on end. The hunter laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. Oh, I don't think so, he said. She's with you.
She's one of you.
He raised his weapon, a long, silver blade that glinted in the fading light. And that means, he said, his voice cold and deadly, she dies with you. The other hunters followed suit, raising their weapons, their eyes fixed on Kalen and Brielle. The air crackled with tension, with the threat of violence. Brielle looked at Kalen, her heart pounding in her chest. She was terrified, but she was also strangely calm. She had made her choice. She would stand with him. She would fight. Kalen met her gaze, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that looked like love. He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. And then he moved. He lunged forward, a blur of motion, his body transforming, shifting, changing. His clothes ripped, his bones cracked, his muscles bulged. He was growing, becoming something other. Something monstrous. Something magnificent. Brielle gasped, her eyes wide with shock and awe. She was witnessing something incredible, something impossible. She was witnessing the awakening of a shadow that would protect her, or consume them both. Chapter 4. A bond forged in ice. The transformation was instantaneous, yet it felt like an eternity. One moment, Kalen stood before her, a man of imposing strength and unsettling beauty. The next, a creature of myth and legend ripped its way free. Fur, the color of midnight, erupted from his skin, his hands and feet morphing into powerful paws tipped with claws that glinted like polished obsidian. His face elongated, his jaw widening to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. His silver eyes, now glowing with an even more intense light, remained the only recognizable feature in the monstrous form that towered over her. He was a wolf, but a wolf unlike any she had ever seen, even in her Alaskan wilderness experience. This was no ordinary animal. This was something ancient, something primal, something divine. He was the embodiment of the wild, of the untamed power of nature. He was a werewolf. The hunters, despite their fanatic zeal, recoiled in momentary shock. Their faces, previously hardened with grim determination, were now etched with a flicker of fear. But it was a fleeting hesitation. They recovered quickly, their training, their hatred, overriding their primal instincts. The leader, his cruel smile replaced by a snarl, raised his silver blade. Abomination,
he spat.
We will cleanse this world of your filth. The other hunters echoed his cry, their weapons raised, ready to strike. The transformed Kalen, for it was still him, she could feel it, see it in his eyes, let out a roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet. It was a sound of pure rage, of defiance, of a power that had been suppressed for too long. He lunged at the hunters, a blur of black fur and flashing claws. The battle was joined. Brielle stood frozen, watching the scene unfold before her with a mixture of horror and fascination. It was a brutal, savage dance of death, a clash between ancient forces and modern hatred. The hunters, despite their fear, were skilled, their silver weapons designed to inflict maximum damage on Kalen's kind. They moved with a coordinated precision, attacking from all sides, trying to overwhelm him with their numbers. But Kalen was too strong, too fast, too powerful. He moved with an agility that defied his size, dodging and weaving, his claws tearing through the hunter's defenses. He was a whirlwind of fury, a storm of teeth and claws. Brielle watched in awe as he fought, his every movement a testament to his raw power, his primal strength. She felt a strange sense of pride, of connection to this magnificent creature, this being who had chosen to protect her. But she also felt fear. Not for herself, but for him. She saw the way the hunter's silver weapons glinted in the fading light, the way they targeted his flanks, his vulnerable spots. She knew that silver was his weakness, a poison to his kind. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand there and watch him fight, watch him die. She looked around, her eyes scanning the snow-covered ground, searching for anything that could help. Her gaze fell upon her geological survey equipment, discarded when the ground had collapsed. The heavy pack, the metal tools, an idea sparked in her mind. It was a desperate, long-shot gamble, but it was all she had. She ran towards the pack, ignoring the chaos of the battle raging around her. She reached the pack, her fingers fumbling with the straps, her heart pounding in her chest. She pulled out the largest tool, a heavy, steel geological hammer, its head designed to break through the toughest rock. It wasn't silver, but it was metal. And it was heavy. It was enough. She turned back to the battle, her grip tightening on the hammer. Kalen was surrounded, the hunters pressing their attack. He was tiring. She could see it in his movements, in the labored rise and fall of his chest. One of the hunters, a burly man with a scarred face, lunged at Kalen, his silver knife aimed for his throat. Kalen dodged, but the blade grazed his flank, drawing a line of crimson blood. He roared in pain, his body flinching. That was all the opening Brielle needed. She charged forward, screaming at the top of her lungs, the geological hammer raised above her head. The hunter, surprised by her sudden attack, turned towards her, his eyes widening in disbelief. He didn't have time to react. Brielle swung the hammer with all her might, bringing it down on the hunter's arm, the arm that held the silver knife. The sound of metal striking bone was sickening, but she didn't hesitate. The hunter screamed in pain, dropping the knife, his arm hanging limp and broken at his side. Brielle didn't stop. She swung the hammer again and again, striking at any hunter who came near, her fear replaced by a fierce, protective rage. She was fighting for Kalen, for the creature who had saved her, for the being who had awakened something within her. Kalen, seeing her attack, seemed to find a renewed surge of energy. He roared again, a sound of triumph and gratitude, and renewed his attack with even greater ferocity. The tide of the battle began to turn. The hunters, surprised by Brielle's unexpected intervention and weakened by Kalen's relentless assault, began to falter. One by one, they fell, their silver weapons clattering to the snow-covered ground. The leader, his face contorted with rage and hatred, made one last, desperate attack, lunging at Kalen with his silver blade. But Kalen was too quick. He dodged the blow, his powerful jaws clamping down on the hunter's arm, crushing bone and severing flesh. The hunter screamed, a high-pitched, agonizing wail that was cut short as Kalen shook him violently, then tossed him aside like a rag doll. The remaining hunters, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. They turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the ragged gasps of Brielle's breath and the low growl of the transformed Kalen. He stood there, panting, his fur matted with blood, both his own and his enemies'. He looked at Brielle, his silver eyes, still glowing with that unearthly light, filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. Slowly, he began to transform back. The fur receded, his bones shifted, his muscles contracted. He was becoming human again, the monstrous form giving way to the man she had first met. The transformation was painful. She could see it in his face, in the way he clenched his fists, in the low groans that escaped his lips. But he endured it, his gaze never leaving hers. Finally, he stood before her, naked, his body covered in sweat and blood, but undeniably human. He was Kalen again, but he was also different. He was more. He looked at her, his silver eyes, now devoid of their unearthly glow, filled with a vulnerability that made her heart ache. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse, raw with emotion. Brielle, still clutching the geological hammer, her hands trembling, could only nod. She was speechless, overwhelmed by the events that had just transpired, by the bond that had been forged between them, a bond forged in ice, in blood, in the heart of a frozen wasteland. A bond that was both terrifying and exhilarating. A bond she knew would change her life forever. The lingering scent of pine, blood, and that unique musk was a testament to the undeniable truth. Her world had just irrevocably expanded. Chapter 5. The Lost Court's Legacy. Kalen swayed, his naked body trembling from the exertion and the lingering pain of the transformation. Brielle, dropping the geological hammer with a clang, rushed to his side, her arms instinctively reaching out to support him. He leaned heavily on her, his skin surprisingly warm against hers, despite the freezing air. "We need to get you out of the cold," she said, her voice filled with concern. She looked around, her eyes scanning the clearing. The bodies of the fallen hunters lay scattered across the snow, a grim reminder of the violence that had just taken place. She shuddered, but forced herself to focus. "There's a small cave," Kalen managed, his voice strained. "Nearby." I used to," he trailed off, his breath catching in his throat. Brielle understood. He was referring to his imprisonment, to the centuries he had spent trapped in this frozen wasteland. The thought sent a wave of sympathy washing over her. "Show me," she said, her voice gentle. He nodded, his head leaning against her shoulder. She could feel the dampness of his hair against her cheek, the rapid beat of his heart against her arm. He smelled of pine and earth and something else, something uniquely him, a scent that was both wild and comforting. With her arm around his waist, supporting his weight, they slowly made their way towards the edge of the clearing, towards the towering pines that ringed the amphitheater. Kalen guided her, his steps faltering, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cave was hidden behind a thick curtain of snow-laden branches, almost invisible to the untrained eye. Kalen pushed aside the branches, revealing a narrow opening in the rock face. It was small, barely large enough for two people to stand comfortably, but it was sheltered from the wind and the snow. The air inside was noticeably warmer than outside, a testament to the insulating properties of the rock. Brielle helped Kalen inside, gently lowering him to the ground. He sat with his back against the rock wall, his eyes closed, his breathing still labored. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The cave was bare, save for a few scattered rocks and a thin layer of dried leaves and pine needles on the floor. It was a bleak, desolate place, a stark reminder of Kalen's long isolation. She felt a surge of anger, a fierce protectiveness towards this man, this creature who had endured so much. She wanted to know his story, to understand his past, to help him heal. "Kalen," she said softly, kneeling beside him. He opened his eyes, his silver gaze meeting hers. He looked exhausted, drained, but there was a spark of something else in his eyes, a flicker of hope, of resilience. "I need to explain," he said, his voice hoarse. Brielle nodded. "I know," she said. "But first you need to rest." She removed her heavy parka, spreading it on the ground beside him. "Lie down," she said. "Try to get warm." He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. He seemed reluctant to relinquish control, to show weakness. But he was clearly exhausted, and he finally obeyed, slowly lowering himself to the ground, his head resting on the folded parka. Brielle sat beside him, watching him, her heart aching with a mixture of sympathy and something else. Something deeper. Something that was starting to feel a lot like love. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowly becoming more even. She reached out, her hand hovering over his arm, hesitant to touch him, to intrude on his privacy. But she couldn't resist. She gently placed her hand on his arm, her fingers brushing against his skin. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply accepted her touch. A warmth spread through her, a feeling of connection, of intimacy. It was a strange sensation, this closeness to a man she had only just met, a man who was not entirely human. But it felt right. After a while, his breathing deepened, his body relaxing into sleep. Brielle continued to sit beside him, watching him, her mind racing. She had so many questions, so much to learn. She thought about the hunters, about their hatred, their fanaticism.
Who were they?
Why were they so determined to kill Kalen? And what did he mean when he said he was from a lost court? She looked at Kalen, his face peaceful in sleep, his dark hair framing his strong features. He was beautiful, even with the scars that marred his skin, scars that were a testament to his past struggles. She felt a surge of protectiveness towards him, a fierce determination to keep him safe. She had stumbled into his world, into his life, and she knew that she could never go back. She was bound to him now, by fate, by destiny, by something she couldn't quite name. She leaned back against the rock wall, her gaze fixed on Kalen's sleeping form. The silence of the cave was broken only by his even breathing and the occasional crackle of the ice outside. As she sat there, in the dim light of the hidden cave, she began to piece together the fragments of information she had gleaned, the whispers she had heard, the words Kalen had spoken. The Lost Court, a kingdom of werewolves, ruled by a powerful alpha. A kingdom that had been betrayed, destroyed, its people scattered and hunted. Kaelin, the alpha, imprisoned, his memory forgotten. And she, Brielle, a woman of science, a woman of logic, was somehow connected to this lost kingdom, to this forgotten alpha. She was, as he had said, to take her rightful place. But what was that place? What was her role in this ancient drama? She felt the weight of the unknown, the burden of a destiny she didn't understand. But amidst it all, one thing was clear in her mind and heart. Whatever it might mean, whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't abandon Kaelin. This strange, wonderful, tormented man was now a part of her, and she of him. The thought, instead of frightening her, brought a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She would see this through. For him. For them both. She dozed lightly, exhausted, but her hand stayed on Kaelin's arm, a silent promise. When she woke again, it would be to a different world. Chapter 6. Whispers of a Forgotten Queen. Brielle woke to the feeling of warmth. Not the harsh, dry warmth of a heater, but a gentle, encompassing warmth that seeped into her bones, chasing away the lingering chill of the cave. She opened her eyes, blinking in the dim light, and found herself nestled against Kaelin's side, his arm wrapped around her, holding her close. He was awake, his silver eyes watching her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. He had shifted during the night, moving closer to her, seeking her warmth, her presence. It was an instinctive act, a gesture of trust and affection that spoke volumes. She blushed, feeling a warmth spread across her cheeks, despite the cold air of the cave. She was acutely aware of his nakedness beneath the shared covering of her parka, of the hard planes of his chest pressed against her back, of the steady rhythm of his heart beating in time with her own. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low rumble, still thick with sleep. "Morning," she replied, her voice a little breathless. She shifted slightly, trying to create some space between them, but he tightened his hold, his arm pressing her closer. "Don't," he said, his voice a whisper. "You're warm." She didn't argue. She couldn't. She was warm, and so was he, and the feeling of being held by him, of being protected by him, was too comforting to resist. They lay there for a while, in silence, simply enjoying the closeness, the shared warmth, the unspoken connection between them. It was a moment of peace, a respite from the chaos and violence that had engulfed them. Finally, Brielle stirred, remembering the questions that had been swirling in her mind before she fell asleep. "Kaelin," she said softly, "you said you needed to explain." He sighed, his breath stirring her hair. He knew he couldn't postpone the conversation any longer. He had to tell her the truth, the whole truth, about who he was, about what had happened, about her. He released her, sitting up, pulling the parka around his shoulders to cover his nakedness. He looked at her, his silver eyes searching hers, trying to gauge her reaction, to prepare her for what he was about to say. "I was the alpha of the lost court," he began, his voice hesitant, as if he were speaking words that had been buried for centuries. "A kingdom of werewolves, hidden from the human world, protected by ancient magic." Brielle listened, her mind struggling to reconcile the reality of her life with the fantastical tale he was unfolding. She had seen him transform, had witnessed the violence of the hunters, had felt the strange power of the whispering stones. She knew that his words were true, however unbelievable they might seem. "We lived in peace, in harmony with nature," Kaelin continued, his voice gaining strength, his eyes glowing with a faint, silvery light, a reflection of his past glory. "But we were betrayed. By one of our own. A sorcerer, driven by ambition and greed, who sought to usurp my power, to claim the throne for himself." He paused, his jaw clenching, his fists tightening. The memory of the betrayal, of the loss, was still raw, still painful. "He used dark magic," he said, his voice a low growl, "a forbidden magic that twisted the minds of my people, turned them against me. He unleashed a curse, a plague that ravaged our kingdom, driving us to madness, to violence." He looked at Brielle, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. I fought, he said. I fought to save my people, to break the curse. But I was overwhelmed,
Captured.
imprisoned. He gestured to the cave, to the surrounding mountains.
Here, he said.
In this frozen wasteland, he stripped me of my memory, of my power, leaving me to wander, lost and alone, for centuries. Brielle felt tears welling up in her eyes. She couldn't imagine the pain, the loneliness, the despair he must have endured. But you remember now? She asked, her voice trembling. He nodded. The whispering stones, he said. They awakened me. Your presence, it triggered something. Fragments of memory, flashes of the past. He looked at her, his silver eyes piercing through her, searching her soul. And you, he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. You are the key. Brielle's heart skipped a beat. The key? She repeated, her voice barely audible. What do you mean? Kalen hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He seemed reluctant to speak, as if he were afraid of her reaction. The sorcerer, he finally said, his voice low, he didn't just want to usurp my power. He wanted to erase the royal line, to ensure that no one could ever challenge his rule. He paused, taking a deep breath. He cast a spell, he said, a spell that bound the soul of my queen to the human world. To a descendant, a woman who would carry the bloodline, the memory, the power of the lost court. He looked at her, his silver eyes locking onto hers, his gaze filled with a mixture of hope and fear. That woman, he said, his voice trembling, is you. Brielle stared at him, her mind reeling. She was a descendant of a werewolf queen? It was impossible. And yet she remembered the strange pull she had felt at the whispering stones, the whispering that had seemed to speak to her soul, the feeling of coming home. She remembered the recognition she had seen in Kalen's eyes, the way he had looked at her, as if he had known her forever. It all made sense now. The connection she felt to him, the bond that had been forged between them, was not just a matter of chance. It was destiny. She was the forgotten queen. Or at least a part of her was. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She felt a wave of dizziness, of disorientation. She was Brielle Vex, a geologist, a woman of science, of reason. And yet she was also something more. Something ancient. Something magical. The whispers she dismissed as wind, the map she'd thought coincidence, the draw to this desolate place, it wasn't happenstance. It was heritage, screaming to be acknowledged. And now, looking at Kalen, seeing the hope and the fear and the undeniable knowing in his eyes, she had a choice to make. Accept this impossible truth, or run from a destiny she couldn't comprehend. Chapter 7. The Price of Forbidden Knowledge. The silence in the cave stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the ragged breaths Brielle was taking as she tried to process Kalen's revelation. She, a descendant of a werewolf queen? It felt like a dream, a bizarre, fantastical dream that she couldn't quite wake up from. I don't understand. She finally managed, her voice trembling. How can this be possible? Kalen sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. He knew this was a lot to take in, a monumental shift in her understanding of herself, of the world. He had centuries to, at least partially, adjust to his reality. She had minutes. The magic of the lost court was powerful, he said, choosing his words carefully. It wove itself into the fabric of our being, into our bloodlines. The sorcerer's spell, while intended to destroy, only transformed. It scattered the essence of my queen, binding it to a line of human descendants, ensuring that her spirit, her power, would eventually return. He looked at her, his silver eyes filled with a deep longing, a yearning for the past, for the woman he had lost. You carry her essence, Brielle, he said softly. Her strength, her courage, her love. Brielle felt a strange mix of emotions swirling within her. Fear, confusion, disbelief, but also something else. Something that resonated with his words, with the feeling she had experienced at the Whispering Stones. A sense of recognition. A sense of belonging. But I'm not a werewolf, she said, stating the obvious. Kalen shook his head. Not in the physical sense, he said. But the bloodline is there, the potential. The magic it's dormant, waiting to be awakened. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, hesitant to touch her. The whispering stones, he said. They were a catalyst. Your presence, your essence, it triggered a reaction, a release of energy that began the process. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding.
I didn't know, he said.
I didn't remember. Not until I saw you. Not until I felt you. Brielle felt a blush rise to her cheeks. She remembered the way he had looked at her, the intensity of his gaze, the way he had held her, protected her. It wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper, something more profound. A soul bond. What does this mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? Kalen's expression turned grim. It means, he said, that you are in danger. The same forces that sought to destroy the lost court, that hunted us to near extinction, they will be looking for you. They will sense the awakening of your power, the return of the Queen's bloodline. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a fierce protectiveness.
The hunters, he said.
They were just the beginning. There are others. More powerful. More dangerous. Brielle felt a chill run down her spine. She had already witnessed the violence of the hunters, their fanatical hatred. The thought of facing something even more powerful was terrifying.
But why? She asked.
Why are they so determined to destroy your kind? Kalen's jaw clenched, his fists tightening. Fear, he said, his voice laced with bitterness. Ignorance. The same reasons humans have always persecuted those they don't understand. They fear our power, our connection to the natural world, our difference. He paused, his gaze softening as he looked at her. But there's more to it than that, he said. The sorcerer, the one who betrayed us, he sought to control not just the lost court, but the human world as well. He believed that werewolves, with their strength, their magic, were destined to rule. He wanted to use that power for his own selfish ends. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. My queen, he said, she opposed him. She believed in balance, in harmony between the human and the supernatural worlds. She fought to protect that balance, to prevent the sorcerer from achieving his goals. He reached out, gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. You have her spirit, Brielle, he said softly. Her courage, her compassion, her wisdom. Brielle felt tears welling up in her eyes. She was overwhelmed by the weight of this revelation, by the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. She was just an ordinary woman, a geologist, living a quiet, solitary life. How could she possibly face such a challenge? But as she looked at Kalen, at his vulnerable, hopeful gaze, she knew that she couldn't turn away. She couldn't ignore the truth, however unbelievable it might seem. She was connected to him, to the lost court, to a destiny she didn't understand, but one she was compelled to embrace. What do we do? She asked, her voice trembling, but firmer than before. Kalen smiled, a slight, almost imperceptible smile, but it was enough to fill her with a sense of hope, of courage. We fight, he said, his voice resolute. We reclaim what was lost. We restore the balance. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. His grip was strong, reassuring. But first, he said, we need to understand your power. We need to awaken the queen within you. He looked at her, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of determination and love. A spark, so faint it was almost imperceptible, but growing. And that, he said, means returning to the whispering stones. The thought was daunting, terrifying, even. But looking into Kalen's eyes, she knew she wasn't alone. And that made all the difference. It was a dangerous path, a journey into the unknown. But it was a journey they would take together. Chapter 8. Scars of the past, bonds of the future. Leaving the relative safety of the cave felt like stepping into a different world. The sun, though still low on the horizon, had risen enough to cast long shadows across the snow-covered landscape, painting the scene in hues of blue and gray. The air was crisp and cold, biting at Brielle's exposed skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was still reeling from Kalen's revelations, from the impossible truth of her heritage. Kalen, wrapped in her parka, walked beside her, his steps more steady now, his strength returning. He had insisted on carrying her pack, despite her protests, his way of showing his gratitude, his protectiveness. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the packed snow. Brielle glanced at Kalen, studying his profile. The lines of exhaustion were still etched on his face, but there was a new determination in his eyes, a sense of purpose that had been absent before. She thought about the scars that crisscrossed his body, scars that were a testament to his battles, his suffering, his resilience. She wanted to ask him about them, to understand the stories they held, but she hesitated, unsure if he was ready to share those painful memories. As if sensing her thoughts, Kalen spoke, his voice low, almost to himself. They were torturers, he said, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. The sorcerer's henchmen. They enjoyed inflicting pain. Brielle felt a surge of anger, a fierce protectiveness towards this man who had endured so much. She wanted to reach out, to touch him, to offer some comfort, but she wasn't sure how. Their relationship was so new, so fragile, built on a foundation of shared danger and a destiny she didn't fully understand. They used silver, he continued, his voice tight. They knew it was our weakness. They used it to control us, to break us. He paused, his jaw clenching, his fists tightening. But they couldn't break me, he said, his voice filled with a quiet defiance. They could torture my body, but they couldn't touch my spirit. They couldn't erase my memory completely. He looked at her, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. You, he said, you brought it back. Your presence, your essence, it was like a key, unlocking the memories that had been buried for so long. Brielle felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling of connection, of intimacy. She had helped him, had given him back something precious, something that had been stolen from him. I'm glad, she said, her voice a little choked with emotion. He smiled, a slight, almost imperceptible smile, but it was enough to light up his face, to chase away the shadows that lingered in his eyes. We should talk about your scars, too, he said, his voice gentle, his gaze shifting to her hands, still gloved, but he seemed to be looking beyond them, at the unseen wounds she carried within. Brielle was surprised. She hadn't expected him to turn the conversation to her, to acknowledge her own pain. I don't have any scars, she said, her voice hesitant. He shook his head, his silver eyes piercing through her, seeing beyond her defenses. Everyone has scars, Brielle, he said softly. Some are visible, some are hidden, but they all shape us, they all make us who we are. He paused, his gaze searching hers. You said you chose this life, he said, gesturing to the vast, desolate landscape. A solitary life.
Why?
Brielle felt a lump form in her throat. She had never talked about this with anyone, not even with her closest friends, the few she had back in Anchorage. It was a part of her past, a wound that she had tried to bury, to forget. But she looked at Kalen, at his compassionate, understanding gaze, and she knew that she could trust him. She could share her pain with him, her vulnerability. I lost someone, she said, her voice trembling. My husband. He died in an accident.
Un club in accident.
She paused, taking a deep breath, trying to control the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. It was my fault, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I pushed him. I encouraged him to take risks. She couldn't finish the sentence. The guilt, the grief, the regret washed over her, a tidal wave of pain that she had been holding back for years. Kalen reached out, gently taking her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. His grip was strong, reassuring. It wasn't your fault, Brielle, he said softly. Accidents happen. You can't blame yourself. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. But I do, she said. I always have. I ran away. I hid myself here, in the wilderness, trying to escape the pain, the guilt. He squeezed her hand, his touch sending a warmth through her, a feeling of comfort, of understanding. But you can't escape it, Brielle, he said gently. You have to face it. You have to heal. He looked at her, his silver eyes filled with a deep compassion, a profound empathy. "We all have scars, Brielle," he repeated. "But they don't define us. They make us stronger. They teach us to love more deeply, to cherish the moments we have, to live without regrets." His words resonated with her, striking a chord deep within her soul. He was right. She couldn't run away from her past, from her pain. She had to face it, to learn from it, to grow from it. And she wasn't alone. She had Kalen, this strange, wonderful, tormented man who had his own scars, his own pain, but who was also strong, resilient, and loving. She squeezed his hand, returning the pressure, her heart filled with a gratitude, a hope that she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, making them sparkle with a silvery light. "We'll heal together, Brielle," he said. "We'll face the future together." And as they continued their trek towards the Whispering Stones, towards the unknown, towards their destiny, Brielle felt a sense of peace, of purpose, that she hadn't thought possible. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined her. They were a part of her, but they were not all of her. She was more than her pain, more than her grief. She was a survivor, and she was ready to fight. The first steps had been taken toward building the future. It might be fragile, barely solidified, but the foundation forged of shared pain and tentative trust was there. Chapter 9. The Hunter's Moon Rises. The journey back to the Whispering Stones was fraught with a tension that was both palpable and unspoken. The memory of the brutal encounter with the hunters hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded them. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange, purple, and red, a breathtaking spectacle that contrasted sharply with the grim reality of their situation. As darkness crept in, a full moon, large and luminous, began to rise, casting an eerie, silver glow over the landscape. Brielle shivered, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck, though the chill she felt was not entirely due to the cold. Kalen, walking beside her, seemed to sense her unease. He glanced at the moon, his expression hardening. "The hunter's moon," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. Brielle looked at him, her eyebrows raised in question. "It's a time of heightened power," he explained, "for both werewolves and their enemies. The hunters will be stronger tonight, more aggressive." Brielle felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She had already witnessed the hunters' strength, their ferocity. The thought of facing them again under a full moon was terrifying. "We need to be careful," Kalen continued, his gaze scanning the surrounding landscape. "They could be anywhere." He stopped, sniffing the air, his nostrils flaring. He was like a wild animal, attuned to every scent, every sound, every shift in the environment. "They're close," he said, his voice a low growl. "I can smell them." Brielle's heart pounded in her chest. She looked around, her eyes straining to see through the darkness, but the shadows of the trees, elongated by the moonlight, seemed to conceal 1,000 hidden dangers. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kalen didn't answer immediately. He was thinking, calculating, assessing the situation. He was the alpha, the protector, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. "We need to reach the Whispering Stones," he finally said. "It's the only place where we have a chance. The magic there's stronger. It can protect us." He looked at her, his silver eyes filled with a fierce determination. "But we need to be quick," he said. "And we need to be quiet." He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Stay close to me," he said. "And don't make a sound." They moved on, their steps silent on the snow-covered ground. They were like shadows themselves, blending into the darkness, their movements guided by instinct and necessity. Brielle's senses were on high alert, her ears straining to hear any sound that might betray the hunter's presence. She could hear the rustle of the wind in the trees, the distant howl of a wolf, the beating of her own heart. The air was thick with tension, with the anticipation of danger. She could feel Kalen's presence beside her, a source of strength and comfort, but also a reminder of the threat that loomed over them. As they neared the whispering stones, the whispering began again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. It was a sound that both terrified and intrigued her, a sound that spoke of ancient power, of a forgotten kingdom, of her own hidden destiny. They reached the edge of the amphitheater, the ring of jagged, black rocks looming before them, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The chasm that had opened up earlier was still there, a gaping maw in the earth, a reminder of the instability of this place. Kaelin stopped, pulling Brielle behind a towering rock, concealing them from view. He peered out, his eyes scanning the clearing, searching for any sign of the hunters. "They're here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can feel them." Brielle's heart skipped a beat. She held her breath, her body tense, ready to flee, ready to fight. And then they appeared. Figures, emerging from the shadows of the trees, their forms dark and menacing against the snow. They were more numerous than before, at least a dozen of them, all armed with silver weapons that glinted ominously in the moonlight. They were led by the same tall, gaunt man who had confronted them earlier, his face contorted with hatred, his eyes burning with a fanatical zeal. "There they are," he shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. "The beast and his queen." The hunters advanced, their movements slow and deliberate, their weapons raised, ready to strike. They were like a pack of wolves themselves, circling their prey, preparing for the kill. Kaelin stepped out from behind the rock, placing himself between Brielle and the hunters, his body a shield, his presence a challenge. He let out a roar, a sound of pure defiance, of untamed power, that echoed through the mountains, silencing the hunters' taunts.
He was ready to fight.
He was ready to protect her. He was ready to die for her. But Brielle was not ready to let him die. She stepped out from behind the rock, standing beside him, her hand reaching for his. She was not a warrior. She was not a queen. Not yet. But she was not afraid. She had Kaelin, and she had the Whispering Stones. And she had a power within her, a power that was just beginning to awaken. A power that might be their only hope. She looked at the hunters, her eyes filled with a newfound determination, a courage she hadn't known she possessed. She was Brielle Vex. And she was also something more. She straightened up, met the lead hunter's gaze, without flinching. The moonlight seemed to focus on her, highlighting her, isolating her in a pool of ethereal light. Something was building, growing, inside her and around them both. It was time. Chapter 10. Trials of Blood and Loyalty. As Brielle stood beside Kaelin, facing the approaching hunters, she felt a strange calmness wash over her. The fear was still there, a knot of tension in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a sense of rightness, a sense of purpose. She looked at Kaelin, his body tense and coiled, ready to transform, ready to fight. He was magnificent, a creature of power and beauty, but she knew that he couldn't face these hunters alone, not under the hunter's moon, not with their silver weapons. She squeezed his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "Wait," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He looked at her, his silver eyes questioning, his brow furrowed in concern. He didn't understand. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the danger. "Trust me," she said, her gaze locking onto his. He hesitated, his instincts warring with her request. He was the alpha, the protector, but he also saw something in her eyes, a determination, a strength that he couldn't ignore. He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. He would trust her. He had to. Brielle turned her attention to the hunters, who were now close enough that she could see their faces, their expressions a mixture of hatred and curiosity. The leader, the tall, gaunt man with the cruel smile, stopped a few feet away, his eyes fixed on Brielle. "So," he said, his voice dripping with scorn, "the queen reveals herself." Brielle didn't flinch. She stood tall, her head held high, her gaze unwavering. "I am Brielle Vex," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing through the clearing. "And I am not your enemy." The hunter laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound.
You are one of them, he said.
A creature of darkness. A monster. Brielle shook her head. I am human, she said. But I am also connected to the lost court, to the werewolves. I am a descendant of their queen. The hunter's eyes narrowed. He seemed to be assessing her, trying to determine if she was telling the truth. And what does that mean? He asked, his voice laced with suspicion. It means, Brielle said, that I understand your fear, your hatred, but it is misplaced. The werewolves of the lost court were not monsters. They were protectors of the balance, of the harmony between the human and the supernatural worlds. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the hunters, trying to reach them, to make them understand. They were betrayed, she said, by one of their own. A sorcerer who sought to use their power for his own selfish ends. He twisted their minds, turned them against each other, unleashed a curse that ravaged their kingdom. She looked at Kaelin, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had endured, for the loss he had suffered. Kaelin, she said, is the last of the true alphas. He fought to save his people, to break the curse. But he was overwhelmed, imprisoned. She turned her attention back to the hunters, her eyes pleading for understanding. He is not your enemy, she repeated. He is a victim.
Just like you.
You are driven by fear, by ignorance, by a hatred that has been passed down through generations.
But it is a lie.
A deception. The hunters remained silent, their faces impassive, their weapons still raised. Brielle didn't know if they were listening, if they were even capable of understanding. The leader, however, seemed to be intrigued. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Brielle. And you, he said, what is your role in all of this? Brielle took a deep breath. I don't know, she said honestly. I'm still learning. But I believe that I am meant to help. To restore the balance. To heal the wounds of the past. She looked at the whispering stones, at the ring of jagged, black rocks that seemed to hum with a hidden power. This place, she said, it holds the key. It is a gateway, a connection to the lost court. It can help us understand. It can help us heal. The leader smiled, a cruel, mocking smile. You expect us to believe this?
He said.
You expect us to trust you, a werewolf lover? Brielle flinched at his words, at his insulting tone, but she held her ground. I expect you to listen, she said. To open your minds, your hearts. To see the truth. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the hunters.
I know it's not easy, she said.
To question everything you've been taught, everything you believe. But it is necessary. If you want to end this cycle of violence, of hatred, you must be willing to change. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the whispering of the stones, the rustle of the wind in the trees. Finally, the leader spoke. Prove it, he said, his voice cold and challenging. Brielle looked at him, her eyebrows raised in question. Prove what? Prove that you are who you say you are, he said. Prove that you have the power of the queen. Prove that you can control the beast. He gestured to Kaelin, his eyes filled with contempt. Brielle's heart skipped a beat. She knew what he was asking. He wanted her to transform, to show them her power.
But she didn't know how.
She had felt the stirrings of something within her, the awakening of a hidden potential, but she had no control over it. It was a wild, untamed force, a power that could just as easily destroy her as save them. She looked at Kaelin, her eyes pleading for guidance, for help. He met her gaze, and with a barely perceptible nod, gave his consent. It was up to her. The fate of the lost court, of her relationship with Kaelin, perhaps of humanity's interaction with the werewolves, rested on what she did next. Chapter 11. The Heart of the Mountain's Fury. Kaelin watched Brielle, his heart a knot of anxiety and hope. He knew what the hunter was asking, what he was demanding. He knew the risk, the danger. But he also saw the determination in her eyes, the courage that burned within her. He had to trust her. He had to believe in her. Brielle took a deep breath, closing her eyes, trying to calm the storm of emotions that raged within her. She had to focus, to connect with the power that she felt stirring within her, the power of the whispering stones, the power of her ancestry. She reached out, her mind focusing on the stones, on their ancient energy, on their whispers. She felt a tingling sensation, a warmth spreading through her body, starting from her toes and rising up like a wave of heat. She opened her eyes, and they were no longer her own. They glowed with a silvery light, the same unearthly light that she had seen in Kaelin's eyes, the same light that reflected the hunter's moon above. The hunters gasped, taking a step back, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. The leader, however, remained unfazed, his expression skeptical, his eyes challenging. Brielle felt the power surging through her, a wild, untamed force that threatened to overwhelm her. She had to control it, to channel it, to use it. She focused on Kaelin, on his presence, on his love. He was her anchor, her grounding force, the one who could help her navigate this unknown territory. She reached out, her hand hovering over his, her fingers tingling with energy. She could feel his power, his wildness, his submission. He was letting her take control. He was trusting her to lead. She closed her eyes again, taking another deep breath, trying to calm the raging storm within her. She had to find the balance, the harmony, the connection between her human self and her werewolf essence. She focused on the image of the queen, on the stories Kaelin had told her, on the courage, the compassion, the wisdom that she embodied. She was not just Brielle Vex, the geologist, the widow. She was also a descendant of the Lost Court, a carrier of ancient magic, a protector of the balance. She opened her eyes, and the silvery light had subsided, replaced by a calm, clear intensity. She was in control. She looked at the hunters, her gaze unwavering, her voice strong and steady. "I am not your enemy," she repeated. "And neither is Kaelin. We are here to help, to restore the balance, to heal the wounds of the past." The hunters remained silent, their weapons still raised, but their expressions had changed. They were no longer filled with hatred, with fanaticism. They were confused, uncertain. The leader, however, remained defiant. "Words are cheap," he said, his voice cold and challenging. "Show us your power. Control the beast." Brielle knew what he wanted. He wanted her to dominate Kaelin, to force him to submit, to prove that she was in control. But that was not her way. That was not the way of the Lost Court, of the true queen. She looked at Kaelin, her eyes filled with love, with respect, with trust. "Kaelin," she said softly, "will you stand with me? Will you help me heal this broken world?" Kaelin met her gaze, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and love. He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. He transformed, but it was not the savage, uncontrolled transformation of before. It was a slow, deliberate shift, a graceful merging of human and wolf, a testament to his power, his control. He stood before her, not as a monstrous beast, but as a magnificent creature, a being of both worlds, a symbol of balance, of harmony. The hunters gasped, their weapons lowering slightly, their faces filled with awe. They had never seen anything like this before. Brielle reached out, her hand gently touching Kaelin's fur, her fingers tracing the lines of his powerful muscles. She felt a connection to him, a bond that was deeper than words, deeper than blood. It was a soul bond. The whispering of the stones intensified, growing louder, more insistent. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, the air crackling with energy. The chasm that had opened up earlier began to close, the earth mending itself, the jagged rocks merging together, as if guided by an unseen force. The hunter's moon, hanging high in the sky, seemed to shine even brighter, its silver light bathing the clearing in an ethereal glow. Brielle felt a surge of power, a wave of energy that flowed through her, connecting her to Kaelin, to the whispering stones, to the very heart of the mountain. She was not just a descendant of the queen. She was the queen, reborn, awakened. She looked at the hunters, her eyes filled with a newfound authority, a regal presence that commanded respect. "This is the power of the Lost Court," she said, her voice echoing through the clearing, amplified by the magic of the stones. It is a power of balance, of harmony, of healing. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the hunters.
You have a choice, she said.
You can continue to live in fear, in hatred, in darkness. Or you can embrace the truth. You can join us. You can help us restore the balance. The hunters remained silent, their faces a mixture of confusion, awe, and hope. The leader, however, stepped forward, his expression still skeptical, but his eyes filled with a flicker of doubt. And if we refuse? He asked, his voice challenging. Brielle met his gaze, her expression unwavering. Then you will face the consequences, she said, her voice firm and resolute. The power of the lost court is not to be trifled with.
It can protect,
but it can also destroy.
She didn't want to fight.
She didn't want to kill. But she would do whatever it took to protect Kaelin, to protect the balance, to protect the future. The hunters, she sensed, were starting to understand. The demonstration of power, the closing of the chasm, Kaelin's controlled transformation. It had shaken their beliefs. The leader, however, was the key. And he was still resisting. She could see it in his eyes, the struggle between what he'd been taught and what he'd just witnessed. The mountain itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his decision. Chapter 12. A Kingdom Cloaked in Mist. The leader of the hunters, a man named Silas, stood frozen, his gaze locked with Brielle's. He was a man torn, his lifelong convictions challenged by the display of power he had just witnessed. The other hunters, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and fear, shifted uneasily, their weapons lowered, their resolve crumbling. Brielle held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had shown them the power of the lost court, the potential for healing, for balance. But she also knew that fear, ingrained hatred, were powerful forces, not easily overcome. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice hoarse, his words strained. What do you want? Brielle's voice was clear and steady, resonating with the power of the whispering stones. I want peace, she said. I want an end to the violence, the hatred, the fear. I want to restore the balance between the human and the supernatural worlds. She gestured to Kaelin, who stood beside her, a magnificent creature of both wolf and man, a symbol of that balance. The werewolves of the Lost Court were not monsters, she said. They were protectors, guardians of the natural world. They lived in harmony with humans until they were betrayed, driven to near extinction. She looked at Silas, her eyes pleading for understanding.
We can learn from the past, she said.
We can build a future where humans and werewolves can coexist, where the ancient magic can be used for good, for healing, for growth. Silas remained silent, his expression unreadable. He was struggling. Brielle could see it, torn between his ingrained beliefs and the evidence before his eyes. Show me, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Show me this lost court. Brielle hesitated. She hadn't expected this request, this challenge. She didn't know if it was possible, if the lost court still existed, even in some ethereal form. But she looked at Kaelin, his silver eyes filled with a flicker of hope, a yearning for his lost home. He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. He believed it was possible, and she trusted him. She turned back to Silas, her gaze unwavering. I will, she said. But you must be willing to open your mind, your heart. You must be willing to believe. Silas nodded, his expression still guarded, but his eyes filled with a flicker of curiosity. Brielle closed her eyes, reaching out, her mind focusing on the whispering stones, on their ancient power, on their connection to the lost court. She felt the energy surging through her, a wave of heat, a tingling sensation that spread throughout her body. She focused on the image of the lost court, on the stories Kaelin had told her, on the vibrant kingdom, the peaceful coexistence, the harmony with nature. She visualized the towering trees, the crystal-clear streams, the majestic wolves, the people. She opened her eyes, and they glowed with a silvery light, the same unearthly light that had illuminated the clearing before. The air around them shimmered, the temperature dropping, a mist rising from the ground, swirling around them, obscuring the view. The hunters gasped, their weapons dropping to their sides, their faces filled with awe and fear. They were witnessing something incredible, something impossible, something magical. The mist thickened, becoming a dense fog, enveloping them completely, isolating them from the outside world. Brielle felt a strange sensation, a feeling of being transported, of moving through space and time, of crossing a threshold. And then, the mist began to dissipate, revealing a scene that took their breath away. They were no longer in the frozen wasteland of the Alaskan mountains. They were elsewhere. They stood on a grassy hillside, overlooking a valley shrouded in mist. The air was warm, fragrant with the scent of wildflowers and pine. The sun, a golden orb in the sky, cast a warm, inviting light over the landscape. Towering trees, their leaves of vibrant green, reached towards the sky, their branches intertwined, forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. Crystal clear streams meandered through the valley, their waters sparkling in the sunlight. And in the distance, nestled among the trees, they saw it. The Lost Court. It was not a city in the human sense. It was more organic. Buildings crafted from living wood, their walls covered in moss and vines, their roofs adorned with flowers. Bridges arched over the streams, their forms graceful and elegant, crafted from interwoven branches. And everywhere they saw them, the werewolves. Not the monstrous beasts of the hunter's nightmares, but beings of grace and beauty, their forms shifting between human and wolf, their movements fluid and effortless. They were living in harmony with nature, with each other, their faces reflecting a peace, a contentment that was almost palpable. The hunters stared in disbelief, their mouths agape, their eyes wide with wonder. They had never seen anything like this before. It was a world beyond their comprehension, a world of magic, of beauty, of peace. Silas, his face pale, his expression stunned, turned to Brielle. This is real? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Brielle nodded, her eyes filled with tears.
It is, she said. It was.
And it can be again. She looked at Kalen, who stood beside her, his eyes shining with a mixture of joy and sorrow. He was home. But it was a home that had been lost, a home that needed to be rebuilt. He stepped forward, and with his movement, the werewolves below noticed the gathered group on the hill. A hush fell. Even the sounds of nature seemed to quiet, awaiting what would happen next. Kalen took another step and raised his hand in a gesture that was both greeting and command. The future, their collective future, was balancing on the edge of a knife. Chapter 13. The Dance of Deception and Desire. Kalen's raised hand was a signal, a silent communication that resonated through the valley. The werewolves of the Lost Court, their forms shifting between human and wolf, stopped their activities, their heads turning towards the hillside, their eyes fixed on the group standing there. A wave of energy, a palpable force, emanated from them, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and recognition. They sensed Kalen's presence, his power, his return. Kalen lowered his hand, taking a step forward, his gaze sweeping over the valley, his heart filled with a mixture of joy and sorrow. He was home, but it was a home that had been changed, diminished, by the passage of time, by the betrayal, by the curse. They remember, he said, his voice low, almost to himself, his gaze fixed on the werewolves below. They remember. Brielle, standing beside him, felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of hope and fear. This was a pivotal moment, a turning point. The future of the Lost Court, the future of the relationship between humans and werewolves, rested on what happened next. Silas, standing behind them, his face still pale, his expression stunned, whispered, "What do we do?" Brielle turned to him, her gaze unwavering.
"We wait," she said.
"We trust. We show them that we are not their enemies." The werewolves of the Lost Court began to move, their forms flowing through the valley, converging on the hillside, their movements graceful and effortless. They were not attacking, not threatening, but they were also not welcoming. They were observing, assessing. As they approached, Brielle could see their faces more clearly. They were beautiful, their features both human and wolf-like, their eyes reflecting a wisdom, an ancient knowledge that was both captivating and intimidating. Among them, she saw one who stood out, a woman with long, silver hair, her eyes a striking shade of violet, her presence radiating a power, an authority that commanded respect. She was the regent, the one who had ruled the lost court in Kaelin's absence, the one who had kept the memory alive, the hope burning. The regent stopped a few feet away from Kaelin, her gaze fixed on him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rustle of the wind in the trees, the murmur of the streams. Finally, she spoke, her voice clear and strong, resonating with the power of the lost court. "Kaelin," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and hope. "Is it truly you?" Kaelin nodded, his silver eyes meeting hers, his expression filled with a profound sadness, a deep longing. "It is I, Lyra," he said. "I have returned." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, her expression softening. She reached out, her hand gently touching his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his scars, the marks of his suffering. "You have been gone so long," she said, her voice trembling. "We thought we had lost you forever." Kaelin closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, savoring the feeling of connection, of belonging, of home. "I was imprisoned," he said, his voice hoarse. "My memory stolen. But I have returned. And I have brought help." He gestured to Brielle, who stood beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. Lyra's gaze shifted to Brielle, her violet eyes assessing, searching, probing. She was not hostile, but she was cautious, wary. "And who is this?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "This is Brielle," Kaelin said. "She is a descendant of our queen. She carries her essence, her power, her spirit." Lyra's eyes widened, her expression shifting from caution to awe. She looked at Brielle, her gaze intense, searching for any sign of deception, of falsehood. Brielle met her gaze, her own eyes unwavering, her heart filled with a strange mixture of fear and determination. She was not the queen, not yet, but she carried her legacy, her responsibility. "I am here to help," she said, her voice clear and strong. "To restore the balance. To heal the wounds of the past." Lyra continued to study her, her violet eyes piercing through her, seeing beyond her defenses, into her soul. Finally, she nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "I sense the truth in your words," she said. "But the path ahead is not easy. There are challenges, dangers." She looked at Kaelin, her gaze filled with a mixture of concern and warning. "The sorcerer's power, it still lingers," she said. "His followers, they are still out there. They will not welcome your return." Kaelin nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said. "We have already encountered them." He gestured to Silas and the other hunters, who stood behind them, their faces a mixture of fear and shame. Lyra's gaze shifted to them, her expression hardening. "Humans," she said, her voice laced with suspicion. "Hunters." Silas stepped forward, his head bowed, his voice trembling. We were wrong," he said. "We were blinded by fear, by hatred. We did not understand." He looked at Brielle, his eyes filled with a mixture of remorse and hope. "She has shown us the truth," he said. "She has shown us the way." Lyra remained silent, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the hunters, assessing their sincerity, their repentance. Finally, she spoke, her voice firm and resolute. "The lost court has suffered much from the actions of humans," she said. "But we are not a people of vengeance. We are a people of healing, of balance." She looked at Brielle, her violet eyes filled with a newfound respect, a glimmer of hope. "If you are truly the descendant of our queen," she said, "if you are truly willing to help us restore the balance, then you are welcome here. You and your companions." She paused, her gaze shifting to Kaelin, a flicker of something deeper, something more personal, passing between them. A history, Brielle realized. A bond that had endured despite the centuries, despite the separation. But Lyra continued, her voice firm, there will be trials.
Tests.
To prove your loyalty, your strength, your worthiness. She smiled, a slight, almost imperceptible smile, but it was enough to send a shiver down Brielle's spine. This was not just a welcome. It was a challenge, a dance of deception and desire, of power and vulnerability, of destiny. The trials would begin soon, and Brielle knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that they would test her to her very limits. And not all of them would be external. Chapter 14. Echoes of a Shattered Crown. The trials, Lyra explained, were not arbitrary tests of strength or skill, but rather a series of rituals designed to awaken Brielle's dormant powers, to connect her fully with the legacy of the Lost Court's queen, and to assess her ability to lead, to heal, to restore the balance. They were ancient ceremonies steeped in magic and tradition, passed down through generations of werewolves. The first trial took place that very evening, under the light of the hunter's moon, which still hung high in the sky, casting an ethereal glow over the valley. Brielle, dressed in a simple white gown made of woven moonlight, or so it seemed, stood before the assembled werewolves of the Lost Court, her heart pounding in her chest. Kaelin stood beside her, not as a participant, but as a support, a silent presence radiating strength and encouragement. He had offered to undergo the trials with her, but Lyra had refused, explaining that this was Brielle's journey, her path to walk alone. The ceremony began with a chant, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the air, through the ground, through Brielle's very being. It was a sound that spoke of ancient power, of forgotten magic, of a connection to the earth, to the moon, to the very essence of life. Lyra, standing before a large, ancient oak tree, its branches reaching towards the sky like gnarled fingers, raised her hands, her violet eyes glowing with an unearthly light. Brielle Vex, she said, her voice amplified by the magic of the ritual, you stand before us, a descendant of our queen, a carrier of her essence, her power, her spirit. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the assembled werewolves, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, hope, and expectation. Tonight, she continued, we begin the awakening. We begin the journey to restore the balance, to heal the wounds of the past. She turned her attention back to Brielle, her gaze intense, searching. Are you ready? She asked, her voice soft but firm. Brielle took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions that raged within her. Fear, excitement, doubt, determination, they swirled within her, threatening to overwhelm her. But she looked at Kaelin, his silver eyes filled with love, with trust, with belief in her. And she found her strength. I am, she said, her voice clear and steady, echoing through the valley. Lyra nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible smile gracing her lips. She reached out, her hand hovering over a small, silver bowl filled with a shimmering, luminescent liquid. This is the water of remembrance, she said. It holds the memories of our queen, of her life, her love, her sacrifice. She looked at Brielle, her gaze unwavering.
Drink, she said.
And remember. Brielle hesitated. She knew that this was not just a symbolic gesture. It was a powerful ritual, a magical act that would alter her, change her, forever. But she trusted Lyra. She trusted Kaelin. And she trusted herself. She reached out, taking the bowl, her fingers trembling slightly. She brought it to her lips, the cool metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the liquid within. She drank. The liquid tasted of moonlight and tears, of ancient forests and forgotten dreams. It flowed through her, a wave of energy, a surge of power, that filled her with a kaleidoscope of images, of emotions, of memories. She saw the queen, a woman of strength and beauty, her eyes of vibrant green, her hair a cascade of silver. She saw her ruling the Lost Court, her wisdom and compassion guiding her people. She saw her love for Kaelin, a bond that transcended time and space, a connection that was both passionate and profound. She saw the betrayal, The sorcerer's dark magic, the curse that ravaged the kingdom, the violence, the despair. She saw the queen's sacrifice, her desperate attempt to save her people, to protect the balance. And then she saw herself. Or rather, a version of herself, a reflection of the queen, a carrier of her essence, her power, her spirit. The images faded, the memories receding, leaving behind a residue of emotion, of knowledge, of understanding. Brielle lowered the bowl, her hands shaking, her body trembling. She felt different.
Changed.
As if a part of her that had been asleep, dormant, had awakened. She looked at Kalen, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of awe and recognition. He saw her, the real her, the queen within. Lyra stepped forward, her violet eyes glowing with a soft, gentle light. "You have remembered," she said. "You have connected. You have awakened." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, making them sparkle with a magical light. "The first trial is complete," she said. "But there are more to come. More challenges. More discoveries." She paused, her gaze shifting to the ancient oak tree, its branches silhouetted against the moonlit sky. "Tomorrow," she said, "we will journey to the heart of the mountain. There, you will face your greatest fear. And you will find your true power." Brielle felt a chill run down her spine. The heart of the mountain. It sounded ominous, dangerous. But she also felt a sense of anticipation, of excitement. She was ready. She had to be. The ceremony ended, the werewolves dispersing, their forms shifting between human and wolf, their voices murmuring in hushed tones. Kalen stepped forward, taking Brielle's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. His grip was strong, reassuring. "You are amazing," he said, his voice filled with pride, with love. Brielle smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. She had passed the first trial. She had taken the first step on this incredible journey. But she also knew that the path ahead was long and arduous. The echoes of a shattered crown still resonated, the wounds of the past still festered, and the sorcerer's shadow still loomed, threatening to engulf them all. The weight of it felt immense, but as she looked at Kalen, at his unwavering support and burgeoning love, she knew she wouldn't face the darkness alone. And that, she realized, was the greatest strength of all. Chapter 15. The Weight of 1,000 Years. The journey to the heart of the mountain was a silent, solemn affair. The werewolves of the Lost Court, led by Lyra, moved with a quiet grace through the misty valley, their forms shifting between human and wolf, their senses attuned to the subtle nuances of the environment. Brielle walked beside Kalen, her hand clasped in his, their steps synchronized, their bodies close. She felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread, her mind replaying the images, the emotions, the memories that had flooded her during the previous night's ritual. She had glimpsed the queen's life, her love, her sacrifice. She had felt the weight of her responsibility, the burden of her legacy. And she had understood, with a chilling clarity, the danger that still threatened them, the darkness that lurked in the shadows. The heart of the mountain was not just a physical location, it was a place of power, a nexus of energy, where the veil between the human and the supernatural worlds was thin, where the past and the present converged. Lyra had explained that it was here that the queen had made her last stand, her final attempt to protect her people, to defeat the sorcerer. It was here that she had channeled the power of the mountain, unleashing a force that had shattered the sorcerer's army, but had also broken her. Brielle felt a shiver run down her spine. She was walking in the footsteps of a legend, a woman of immense power and courage, a woman who had sacrificed everything for her people. As they climbed higher, the landscape changed, the lush vegetation giving way to bare rock, the mist thinning, revealing a breathtaking view of the valley below. The air grew colder, sharper, the silence more profound. They reached a plateau, a vast expanse of rock, surrounded by towering peaks, their summits shrouded in mist. In the center of the plateau stood a single, massive rock formation, its shape resembling a giant, beating heart. This was it, the heart of the mountain. Brielle felt a strange pull, a magnetic force that drew her towards the rock, a sense of recognition, of homecoming. Lyra stopped before the rock, her violet eyes glowing with an unearthly light. She turned to Brielle, her expression solemn. "This is where it happened," she said, her voice echoing through the silence. "This is where our queen faced her greatest fear. And this is where you will face yours." Brielle's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to expect, what form her fear would take, how she would overcome it. But she looked at Kalen, his silver eyes filled with love, with trust, with belief in her. And she found her courage. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. Lyra nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible smile gracing her lips. She raised her hands, her fingers tracing ancient symbols in the air, her voice chanting in a low, resonant tone. The air around them shimmered, the temperature dropping, a mist rising from the ground, swirling around the rock formation, obscuring it from view. Brielle felt a strange sensation, a feeling of being pulled, of being drawn into the mist, into the rock, into herself. And then she was alone. She stood in a darkness, a void, a place of nothingness. She could see nothing, hear nothing, feel nothing, except for a profound sense of loneliness. And then she heard it, a whisper, a voice, her own voice. "You are afraid," the voice said, a soft, insidious whisper that seemed to come from within her. Brielle felt a chill run down her spine. It was true. She was afraid. Afraid of failing, afraid of losing Kalen, afraid of the power within her. "You are not strong enough," the voice continued, its tone mocking, derisive. "You are not worthy. You are not the queen." Brielle felt tears welling up in her eyes. The voice was preying on her doubts, her insecurities, her deepest fears. "You are just a human," the voice said. "A weak, fragile human. You cannot control the power. It will destroy you." Brielle clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had to fight back. She had to resist the voice, the darkness, the fear. "I am not afraid," she said, her voice trembling, but firm. "I am strong. I am worthy. I am the queen." But the voice laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that echoed through the void. "You lie," it said. "You are afraid. And you should be. Because you are about to die." And then she saw it, a figure, emerging from the darkness, its form shrouded in shadows, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It was the sorcerer. Brielle gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seen him in the memories, in the water of remembrance. But this was different. This was real. He raised his hand, his fingers crackling with energy, a dark, sinister power that threatened to engulf her. "You cannot defeat me," he said, his voice a low growl, filled with hatred and contempt. "I am stronger than you. I am eternal." Brielle felt a wave of terror wash over her, a paralyzing fear that threatened to consume her. But then she remembered. She remembered the queen, her courage, her compassion, her love for Kalen. She remembered Kalen, his strength, his loyalty, his belief in her. And she found her strength. She stood tall, her head held high, her eyes filled with a newfound determination, a power that she had not known she possessed. "I am not afraid of you," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing through the void. "I am Brielle Vex, and I am also the queen." She raised her hand, her fingers tingling with energy, a warm, golden light that emanated from within her, pushing back the darkness, the sorcerer's power. She was not alone. She had the power of the lost court, the power of the whispering stones, the power of love. And that power was stronger than any fear, any darkness, any sorcerer. The battle had begun, a clash between light and shadow, between love and hate, between the past and the future. And the weight of 1,000 years rested on her shoulders. Chapter 16. The Serpent's Kiss, the Wolf's Embrace. The sorcerer, his form flickering in the ethereal light Brielle emanated, sneered. "Such defiance," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom.
It amuses me.
But it will not save you. He lunged, a blur of shadow and malice, his hand outstretched, crackling with dark energy. Brielle reacted instinctively, raising her own hand, a shield of golden light forming before her, deflecting the sorcerer's attack. The impact sent a shockwave through her, a jolt of pain that resonated through her very being. But she held firm, her will unwavering, her focus absolute. You cannot win, the sorcerer taunted, circling her, his eyes burning with hatred. I have destroyed your lineage, your kingdom. You are nothing but a fleeting echo, a pale imitation of a queen long dead. Brielle felt a surge of anger, a righteous fury that burned away the fear, the doubt. The lost court is not dead, she retorted, her voice ringing with power. It lives on, in me, in Kaelin, in the hearts of its people. She launched her own attack, a beam of golden light shooting from her hand, striking the sorcerer's chest. He staggered back, his form flickering, his expression contorted with pain and surprise. He had not expected this resistance, this power. You are stronger than I anticipated, he admitted, his voice grudging. But it is not enough. I have mastered the dark arts, the forbidden magic. I am invincible. He unleashed a torrent of dark energy, a swirling vortex of shadows that threatened to engulf Brielle, to consume her. She fought back, her golden light pushing against the darkness, creating a sphere of protection around her. But the sorcerer's power was immense, his mastery of the dark arts formidable. The darkness pressed in, suffocating her, draining her strength. She felt herself weakening, her light dimming, her resolve faltering. She was losing. And then she heard it.
A roar.
A sound of pure rage, of untamed power, that echoed through the void, shaking the very foundations of this ethereal realm. Kaelin. He had found a way to reach her, to break through the sorcerer's barriers, to join the battle. He appeared beside her, not in his human form, but as the magnificent wolf, his fur the color of midnight, his silver eyes glowing with an unearthly light. He was the embodiment of the wild, of the untamed power of nature, of the lost court. He lunged at the sorcerer, his claws and teeth tearing at the shadows, disrupting the vortex, breaking the sorcerer's hold on Brielle. The sorcerer, enraged, turned his attention to Kaelin, unleashing a barrage of dark energy, his attacks relentless and brutal. But Kaelin was too strong, too fast, too powerful. He dodged and weaved, his movements fluid and effortless, his attacks precise and devastating. He was fighting for his kingdom, for his people, for Brielle. Brielle, seeing Kaelin's attack, felt a surge of hope, of renewed strength. She was not alone. They were together. She joined the battle, her golden light merging with Kaelin's silvery aura, creating a force that was both beautiful and terrifying. They fought side by side, their powers complementing each other, their movements synchronized, their hearts beating as one. The sorcerer, overwhelmed by their combined assault, began to weaken, his form flickering, his power waning. He was losing. He let out a scream of rage, of frustration, of despair. This is not over, he shrieked. I will return. I will destroy you all. And then he vanished, his form dissolving into shadows, his voice fading into silence. The darkness receded, the void collapsing, the ethereal realm dissolving. Brielle and Kaelin found themselves back on the plateau, standing before the heart of the mountain, the mist dissipating, the sun shining brightly in the sky. Lyra and the other werewolves rushed towards them, their faces filled with relief, with joy, with awe. Brielle had faced her greatest fear. She had defeated the sorcerer, at least for now. She had found her true power. She was the queen. Kaelin, now in his human form, stood beside her, his arm wrapped around her waist, his touch sending a warmth through her, a feeling of connection, of love. You did it, he said, his voice filled with pride, with admiration. Brielle smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. She had done it, but she had not done it alone. We did it, she corrected, her gaze meeting his, her eyes filled with love, with gratitude, with hope for the future. The victory was sweet, but it was also bittersweet. The sorcerer was defeated, but not destroyed. He would return, she knew it, and they had to be ready. But for now, they had won. They had reclaimed a piece of their heritage, a fragment of their destiny. They had taken another step on the long, arduous path towards restoring the balance, towards healing the wounds of the past. The serpent's kiss of betrayal had been met and countered by the wolf's embrace of loyalty and love. And that, for the moment, was enough. The future remained uncertain, but they would face it together. Chapter 17. Where Shadows Meet the Dawn. The return to the valley was a celebration, a joyous reunion filled with relief, gratitude, and a renewed sense of hope. The werewolves of the Lost Court, their faces radiant with happiness, welcomed Brielle and Kaelin as heroes, their cheers echoing through the misty landscape. Lyra, her violet eyes shining with pride, embraced Brielle, her touch warm and reassuring. "You have proven yourself, Brielle," she said. "You have shown us your strength, your courage, your worthiness." She paused, her gaze shifting to Kaelin, a flicker of something deeper, something more personal, passing between them. "You have both," she added, her voice filled with emotion. "You have brought us hope. You have shown us the way." The celebration lasted late into the night, a feast of food and drink, of music and dance, of stories and laughter. The werewolves, their forms shifting between human and wolf, reveled in the joy of the moment, their spirits lifted by the victory, by the return of their alpha, by the awakening of their queen. Brielle, sitting beside Kaelin, her hand clasped in his, felt a sense of belonging, of connection, that she had never experienced before. She was a part of this community, this family, this kingdom. But she also knew that the celebration was fleeting, a temporary respite from the challenges that still lay ahead. The sorcerer was defeated, but not destroyed. He would return, she was sure of it, and they had to be ready. As the moon began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Brielle and Kaelin slipped away from the festivities, seeking a moment of solitude, a chance to reflect on the events of the past few days, to plan for the future. They walked hand in hand to a secluded spot overlooking the valley, a grassy knoll bathed in the soft, silver light of the fading moon. "It's beautiful," Brielle said, her voice filled with awe, her gaze sweeping over the misty landscape, the twinkling lights of the Lost Court nestled among the trees. Kaelin nodded, his arm tightening around her waist, his touch sending a warmth through her. "It is," he said. "But it's also fragile, vulnerable." He looked at her, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. "We have much work to do, Brielle," he said. "We need to rebuild the Lost Court, to strengthen our defenses, to prepare for the sorcerer's return." Brielle nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of responsibility. She was the queen, and she had a duty to her people, to her kingdom. "I know," she said. "But how? Where do we even begin?" Kaelin smiled, a slight, almost imperceptible smile, but it was enough to reassure her, to give her hope. "We begin with the Whispering Stones," he said. "They are the key, the source of our power, the connection to the ancient magic." He paused, his gaze shifting to the distant mountains, their peaks shrouded in mist. "We need to understand them better," he said. "To learn their secrets, to harness their energy. We need to restore the balance." Brielle nodded, her mind racing. She remembered the power she had felt at the Whispering Stones, the connection to the earth, to the moon, to the very essence of life. "And the hunters?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Kaelin's expression turned grim. "They're a problem," he said. "They're still out there, driven by fear, by hatred. They will not accept us easily." He paused, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "But Silas," he said. "He is different. He has seen the truth. He has changed." Brielle remembered Silas's remorse, his hope, his willingness to believe. He was a key, a potential ally, a bridge between the human and the supernatural worlds. "We need to reach out to him," she said. "To the other hunters." We need to show them that we are not their enemies. We need to build trust. Kaelin nodded, his agreement evident. It won't be easy, he said. But it is necessary. If we are to survive, if we are to thrive, we must find a way to coexist with the humans. We must restore the balance. They stood there for a while, in silence, simply enjoying the closeness, the shared warmth, the unspoken connection between them. The moon had set, the sky beginning to lighten, the first rays of dawn painting the horizon in hues of pink and gold. Brielle felt a sense of peace, of purpose, that she hadn't felt in years. She had found her home, her love, her destiny. She looked at Kaelin, his silver eyes reflecting the dawn, his face illuminated by the rising sun. He was beautiful, strong, resilient. He was her alpha, her protector, her king. And she was his queen. They leaned in, their lips meeting in a kiss, a tender, passionate embrace that sealed their bond, their commitment, their love. It was a kiss that spoke of hope, of courage, of a future where shadows met the dawn, where humans and werewolves could coexist, where the ancient magic could be used for good, for healing, for growth. The challenges ahead were daunting, the path uncertain. But as the sun rose, casting its golden light over the valley, they knew they were ready. Together. Chapter 18. The Unveiling of Ancient Prophecies. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity, a blend of planning, training, and exploration. Brielle, with Kaelin at her side, immersed herself in the life of the Lost Court, learning its customs, its history, its magic. She spent hours with Lyra, studying ancient texts, deciphering cryptic prophecies, and honing her newfound powers. The Whispering Stones, as Kaelin had predicted, were the key. They were not just a source of power, but a repository of knowledge, a gateway to the past, a window to the future. Brielle discovered that the stones were covered in intricate carvings, symbols that represented the history of the Lost Court, the prophecies of its seers, the secrets of its magic. With Lyra's guidance, she learned to read the symbols, to interpret their meanings, to unlock their hidden power. One prophecy, in particular, caught her attention. It spoke of a shadow war, a conflict between the forces of light and darkness, a battle that would determine the fate of both the human and the supernatural worlds. The prophecy foretold the return of the sorcerer, his quest for ultimate power, his desire to enslave both humans and werewolves. It also spoke of a forgotten queen, a descendant of the royal line, who would rise to challenge him, to restore the balance, to unite the two worlds. Brielle knew, with a chilling certainty, that she was the forgotten queen. The prophecy was about her, about Kaelin, about their destiny. The prophecy also mentioned allies, unexpected helpers who would emerge from the shadows, from the ranks of those who had once been enemies. Silas and the Hunters were clearly a part of this prophecy. Brielle and Kaelin decided to reach out to Silas, to offer him a chance to redeem himself, to join their cause. They sent a message, carried by a swift and stealthy wolf, inviting him to meet them at the Whispering Stones. Silas responded, agreeing to the meeting, his message cautiously optimistic, his tone reflecting a mixture of hope and fear. The meeting took place under the light of a new moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky. Brielle and Kaelin, accompanied by Lyra and a small contingent of werewolves, waited at the Whispering Stones, the air thick with tension, with anticipation. Silas arrived alone, his face pale, his expression guarded, but his eyes filled with a flicker of determination. "You came," Brielle said, her voice gentle, reassuring. Silas nodded, his gaze shifting between Brielle and Kaelin, his body tense, ready for anything. "I did," he said. "I had to." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the Whispering Stones, his expression a mixture of awe and fear. "I've seen things," he said. "Things I can't explain. Things that challenge everything I've ever believed." He looked at Brielle, his eyes pleading for understanding.
"You showed me the truth," he said.
"You showed me another way." He paused, his gaze shifting to Kaelin, his expression filled with a mixture of remorse and respect. "I was wrong," he said. "We were wrong. We were blinded by fear, by hatred. We did terrible things. Kalen nodded, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and forgiveness.
The past is the past, he said.
We cannot change it, but we can learn from it. We can build a better future. He looked at Silas, his gaze unwavering. Will you help us? He asked. Will you join us in restoring the balance? Silas hesitated, his mind clearly wrestling with the enormity of the decision. He was being asked to betray everything he had ever known, to side with those he had once considered enemies. But he looked at Brielle, her eyes filled with hope, with compassion, with a vision of a better future. And he found his answer. I will, he said, his voice firm, resolute. I will help you. I will fight for the balance. Brielle smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude, with relief, with hope. Silas's decision was a turning point, a significant victory. It was a sign that the tide was turning, that the forces of light were beginning to gather. They spent the rest of the night discussing strategy, sharing information, planning their next move. Silas revealed the existence of a network of hunters, scattered across the globe, all bound by the same ancient oath, the same misguided mission. He also spoke of a hidden stronghold, a place where the hunters gathered, trained, and planned their attacks. He offered to lead them there, to help them infiltrate the organization, to disrupt their operations, to weaken their power. It was a risky plan, a dangerous undertaking, but it was also a necessary one. They had to strike at the heart of the enemy, to prevent them from regrouping, from launching another attack. As the dawn approached, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, they finalized their plans, their hearts filled with a mixture of trepidation and determination. They were ready. They had allies. They had a plan. And they had hope. The unveiling of ancient prophecies had given them direction, but it had also revealed the scale of the challenge ahead. It was a daunting task, but with Silas's help and the growing strength of the Lost Court, they were prepared to face it. The fight for the future was about to begin in earnest. Chapter 19. The Battle for a Lost Kingdom. The journey to the hunter's stronghold was arduous and perilous, a trek through treacherous terrain, under the constant threat of discovery. Silas, his knowledge of the hunter's movements and methods proving invaluable, guided them through hidden paths, avoiding patrols, concealing their tracks. Brielle, her senses heightened by her connection to the whispering stones, felt the presence of the hunters, their fear, their hatred, a palpable force that pressed against her, testing her resolve. Kalen, his wolf instincts on high alert, was her protector, his strength and agility a constant reassurance. He moved with a silent grace, his eyes scanning the landscape, his senses attuned to every subtle shift in the environment. Lyra, and the small contingent of werewolves who accompanied them, provided support, their loyalty and courage unwavering. They were a formidable force, a blend of human and wolf, of magic and skill, united by a common purpose. After days of travel, they reached their destination. The hunter's stronghold was a fortress, hidden deep within a remote mountain range, its walls carved from the living rock, its defenses formidable. Silas led them to a secret entrance, a narrow passage concealed behind a waterfall, a hidden path known only to a select few within the hunter organization. This is it, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. This is where they gather, where they plan, where they prepare for war. Brielle felt a chill run down her spine. This was the heart of the enemy, the source of the darkness that threatened to engulf them all. Kalen, his silver eyes glowing with a fierce determination, placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch sending a warmth through her, a feeling of connection, of strength. We're ready, he said, his voice firm, resolute. They entered the passage, the sound of rushing water masking their footsteps, the darkness enveloping them, concealing them from view. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of stone and fear. The passage led them to a vast underground chamber, a cavernous space illuminated by flickering torches, its walls lined with weapons, its floor covered in training mats. Hunters, dozens of them, were gathered there, their faces grim, their expressions determined, their bodies tense and ready for action. They were preparing for war. Brielle and Kaelin, concealed in the shadows, observed the scene, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had infiltrated the enemy's stronghold, but they were outnumbered, outgunned. Silas, his face pale, his expression strained, whispered, "The leader, he's here. He's powerful. More powerful than I ever imagined." Brielle felt a surge of fear, a knot of tension tightening in her stomach. She remembered the sorcerer, his dark magic, his malevolent power. Was this leader connected to him? Was he a disciple? Kaelin, sensing her fear, squeezed her hand, his touch reassuring. "We can do this," he whispered. Together. They had to act quickly, before they were discovered. They had to disrupt the hunters' preparations, to weaken their forces, to send a message. Kaelin, with a silent nod, signaled to Lyra and the werewolves. They moved swiftly, silently, their forms shifting, their claws and teeth extending, their eyes glowing with an unearthly light. The attack was sudden, swift, and brutal. The werewolves, with their superior strength and agility, overwhelmed the hunters, their claws and teeth tearing through flesh and bone, their roars echoing through the chamber. Brielle, her heart pounding in her chest, joined the fray, her hands glowing with golden energy, her powers unleashed. She fought with a ferocity she hadn't known she possessed, her movements guided by instinct, by the ancient magic that flowed through her veins. The hunters, caught by surprise, fought back, their weapons clashing against the werewolves' claws, their shouts and screams filling the air. The battle raged, a chaotic dance of death, a clash between light and darkness, between human and wolf. Brielle, fighting alongside Kaelin, saw him fall, struck by a silver blade, his body convulsing in pain. She screamed, a sound of pure rage, of primal fury, and unleashed a wave of energy, a blast of golden light that sent the hunters flying, clearing a path to Kaelin's side. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his wound, her heart breaking. He was injured, badly. "Kaelin!" she cried, her voice filled with anguish. He looked at her, his silver eyes filled with pain, but also with love. "I'm all right," he gasped, his voice weak. "Fight, Brielle. Fight." She knew she had to. She couldn't let him die. She wouldn't. She stood up, her body trembling with rage, with grief, with determination. She turned to face the remaining hunters, her eyes glowing with a fierce, unearthly light. She was the queen, and she would protect her people. She would protect her love. She raised her hands, her fingers crackling with energy, and unleashed a storm of golden light, a wave of power that engulfed the chamber, obliterating the hunters, destroying their weapons, collapsing their stronghold. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. The stronghold was destroyed, the hunters scattered. But Kaelin was injured, and the leader, she knew, had escaped. The victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the pain of Kaelin's wound and the looming threat of the sorcerer's return. Chapter 20. The Final Confrontation of Hearts. Brielle knelt beside Kaelin, her hands trembling as she examined his wound. The silver blade had pierced his side, a deep, agonizing injury that was slowly poisoning him, weakening him with every passing moment. Tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision, but she forced herself to focus, to channel her energy, to use her powers to heal him. She placed her hands over the wound, her fingers glowing with a warm, golden light, the energy flowing from her, into him, fighting the silver's poison, mending the torn flesh. But it wasn't enough. The silver's effect was too strong, too deeply ingrained. She could slow the damage, but she couldn't stop it completely. Lyra and the other werewolves, their forms shifting back to human, gathered around them, their faces etched with concern, with grief. "We need to get him back to the lost court," Lyra said, her voice urgent. "To the Whispering Stones. Their power, it's the only chance." They carefully lifted Kaelin, his body limp and unresponsive, his breathing shallow and ragged. They carried him out of the collapsed stronghold, out of the darkness, into the light of the setting sun. The journey back to the lost court was a race against time, a desperate struggle to keep Kaelin alive. Brielle, walking beside him, never left his side, her hand clasped in his, her energy constantly flowing into him, sustaining him, keeping him tethered to life. As they reached the valley, the werewolves of the lost court, alerted to their arrival, rushed to meet them, their faces filled with shock, with horror, with despair. They carried Kaelin to the Whispering Stones, laying him gently on the ground before the ancient, enigmatic rocks. The air hummed with power, with anticipation, with a sense of impending doom. Brielle knelt beside him, her tears falling onto his face, her heart breaking. She had failed him. She hadn't been strong enough, fast enough, to protect him. Lyra placed a hand on her shoulder, her touch comforting, reassuring. "You did everything you could, Brielle," she said. "Now it's up to the stones. To the magic." She raised her hands, her violet eyes glowing with an unearthly light, her voice chanting in a low, resonant tone, calling upon the ancient power of the Whispering Stones, invoking the spirits of the lost court, pleading for their help. The stones responded, their surfaces shimmering, their carvings glowing, a wave of energy emanating from them, enveloping Kaelin, bathing him in a soft, silver light. Brielle watched, her breath held captive in her chest, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. She didn't know if it would work, if the stones could heal him, if the magic was strong enough. And then she saw it, a figure, emerging from the shadows, its form dark and menacing, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The sorcerer. He had returned. He raised his hand, his fingers crackling with dark energy, a sinister smile twisting his lips. "Foolish mortals," he said, his voice a low growl, filled with contempt. "You cannot defeat me. I am eternal." He unleashed a blast of dark energy, targeting Kaelin, intending to finish what the hunters had started. But Brielle reacted instinctively, stepping in front of Kaelin, shielding him with her body, raising her hands, a barrier of golden light forming before her, deflecting the sorcerer's attack. The impact sent a shockwave through her, a jolt of pain that resonated through her very being. But she held firm, her will unwavering, her love for Kaelin fueling her strength. "You will not touch him," she said, her voice ringing with power, with defiance. The sorcerer laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that echoed through the valley. "You cannot stop me, little queen," he said. "I am stronger than you. I have mastered the dark arts. I am invincible." He launched another attack, a torrent of dark energy, a swirling vortex of shadows that threatened to engulf her, to consume her. But Brielle was ready. She had learned, she had grown, she had awakened. She was the queen. She channeled the power of the Whispering Stones, the energy of the lost court, the love at her heart, and unleashed a wave of golden light, a force so powerful, so pure, that it shattered the sorcerer's attack, pushing back the darkness, illuminating the valley. The sorcerer staggered back, his form flickering, his expression contorted with pain and surprise. He had not expected this resistance, this power. "You are stronger than I thought," he admitted, his voice grudging. "But it is not enough. I will destroy you. I will destroy everything you love." He raised his hands, preparing for another attack, his fingers crackling with even more intense energy, a darkness that seemed to devour the light. But before he could unleash his power, Kaelin stirred. His eyes, no longer dim and lifeless, but glowing with a fierce, silver light, opened. He looked at Brielle, his gaze filled with love, with gratitude, with strength. He rose, slowly, painfully, but with a determination that defied his injuries. He stood beside her, his arm wrapping around her waist, his body a shield, his presence a source of power. The Whispering Stones pulsed with energy, their light intensifying, bathing them both in a radiant glow. They were connected, united, their powers merging, their love a force that could not be broken. They faced the sorcerer together, their eyes locked with his, their voices joining in a single, powerful cry. "You are defeated," they said, their voices echoing through the valley, amplified by the magic of the stones. "You have no power here. You are banished." And with that, they unleashed their combined power, a wave of golden and silver light, a force so immense, so overwhelming, that it engulfed the sorcerer, shattering his form, dissolving his essence, banishing him from this realm forever. The darkness receded, the light returned, the valley filled with a sense of peace, of relief, of triumph. The sorcerer was gone. Kalen, his strength fading, collapsed into Brielle's arms, his body trembling, his breathing shallow. But he was alive. He was healed. The whispering stones had worked. The magic had saved him. Brielle held him close, her tears falling onto his face, her heart overflowing with love, with gratitude, with joy. They had won. They had faced their greatest fear. They had defeated the darkness. They had saved each other. The final confrontation had been of hearts, of will, of love, more than of physical strength. And in that confrontation, they had found victory. Epilogue. The years that followed were a time of healing, of rebuilding, of growth. The lost court, under the guidance of Brielle and Kalen, flourished. The werewolves, their spirits renewed, their powers strengthened, returned to their ancient ways, living in harmony with nature, protecting the balance between the human and the supernatural worlds. Brielle, embracing her role as queen, proved to be a wise and compassionate leader. She learned to harness her powers, to control the magic that flowed through her veins, to use it for good, for healing, for growth. She became a bridge between the two worlds, fostering understanding, building trust, creating a future where humans and werewolves could coexist peacefully. Kalen, his strength fully restored, stood by her side, his love and support unwavering. He was her king, her protector, her soulmate. He guided her, advised her, and together, they ruled the lost court with wisdom, compassion, and a deep understanding of the delicate balance they were sworn to protect. Silas, true to his word, became a valuable ally. He helped to dismantle the network of hunters, revealing their secrets, exposing their lies, convincing many of them to abandon their misguided mission, to embrace a new path, a path of peace, of understanding, of coexistence. The wounds of the past slowly healed, the scars fading, replaced by a newfound sense of hope, of purpose, of unity. The lost court, once shrouded in mist, in secrecy, became a beacon of light, a symbol of a future where differences were celebrated, where magic and science could coexist, where love could conquer all. Brielle and Kalen, their love deepening with each passing year, often found themselves at the Whispering Stones, the place where their journey had begun, the place where their destinies had intertwined. They would stand there, hand in hand, gazing out over the valley, their hearts filled with gratitude, with peace, with love. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange, purple, and red, Brielle felt a familiar stirring within her, a warmth spreading through her body, a sense of new life. She looked at Kalen, her eyes shining with tears of joy, her hand resting on her stomach. "I think," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "it's time to tell the lost court they're about to have an heir." Kalen's silver eyes widened, his expression shifting from surprise to awe to unbounded joy. He knelt before her, his hands gently cupping her belly, his touch sending a wave of love through her, through their child. "An heir," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "A continuation of the line. A symbol of our future." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a love so profound, so intense, that it took her breath away. "I love you, Brielle," he said. "My queen, my soulmate, my everything." Brielle smiled, her heart overflowing with love, with gratitude, with happiness. "And I love you, Kalen," she said. "My king, my protector, my forever." They kissed, a tender, passionate embrace that sealed their love, their future, their legacy. The sun dipped below the horizon, the stars beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky, the whispering stones humming with a soft, gentle energy, a blessing, a promise, a celebration of life, of love, of a future filled with hope, with peace, with magic. The lost court was lost no more. It had been found, reborn, strengthened by the trials it had endured. And at its heart were a woman who had discovered her destiny and a man who had rediscovered his. The end.